Hi, these are the most interesting historical photos that I could find. Let's go! Lieutenant Nakamura of the Japanese Army is led to the gallows in Singapore on March 14, 1946, after being sentenced for beheading an Indian soldier on Pulo Island during the war. Father Damien lies in bed on Molokai on April 14, 1889, after years of caring for people isolated with Hansen's disease in Hawaii. He chose to live among them when most of the world feared even contact. A Japanese soldier confronts Buddhist monks in a monastery yard during the Nanjing Massacre on December 13, 1937. This rare image shows how even religious spaces were not spared when the city fell. A Dutch woman cuts off her hair in 1945 after being accused of a relationship with a German soldier. Across liberated Europe, shaved heads became a public mark of shame for women seen as collaborators. Tiananmen Square after the June 4, 1989 crackdown, when Chinese troops cleared weeks of student-led protests in Beijing. Hundreds were killed and thousands were wounded as calls for reform were crushed by force. Welsh miners stand after a shift in 1964, faces and clothes darkened by coal dust. Coal built whole towns in Wales, but the job left many workers with damaged lungs and short lives. American troops move a captured Oka at Kadena Airfield in April 1945 on Okinawa. The Oka was a manned suicide aircraft built for one final strike with almost no return chance. 9 unidentified victims of John Wayne Gacy are honored at Oak Ridge Cemetery in Chicago on June 12, 1981. For years, some families had no names to mourn, only coffins and questions. A car sinks into a snow-choked road in upstate New York in 1945. That winter buried whole streets so deeply that even cars vanished between the snow walls. A United States Marine Corps M67 flame tank fires in Vietnam in 1968. It was built to send fire across bunkers and thick cover where obične oružje often failed. Church bells taken across occupied Europe sit in huge rows on March 15, 1940, waiting to be melted down for war use. More than 175,000 bells were seized, turning places of prayer into raw metal for battle. Cars stretched down the block during the 1974 oil embargo, when fuel shortages turned a fill-up into an hours-long wait. The crisis hit so hard that long gas lines became one of the clearest images of the 1970s. The Air Jeep was a United States Army test machine from the 1950s, built to fly like a Jeep without using a runway. It looked like the future, but the Army dropped it and kept regular helicopters instead. Kim Jong-il checks women's shoes in North Korea during the 1980s, years before he took power. He was known for wearing raised heels himself to appear taller. A Finnish soldier moves through the snow in December 1939 during the Winter War. Finnish troops used skis and white camouflage to strike fast in brutal cold that trapped Soviet forces. An Australian soldier fires at portraits of Kim Il-sung and Joseph Stalin in 1950 during the Korean War. The image turns enemy leaders into targets, capturing the raw propaganda fury of that conflict. Farm machinery lies half-buried in South Dakota in 1936 during the Dust Bowl. Dust storms swallowed fields, homes, and tools across the Great Plains for years. Julia O'Neill pins Easter dresses for all 10 of her daughters in 1952. One mother made the same outfit for every girl, turning a crowded home into a perfect line of matching sisters. A Houston family poses with emergency supplies in 1954, ready for a possible nuclear attack. Cold War fear reached so deep that ordinary homes prepared for the end of the world. People in Lower Manhattan stop in the street as the Twin Towers burn on September 11, 2001. In minutes, an ordinary morning turned into one of the most watched disasters in modern history. Starving villagers in Samara province kneel before an American relief worker during the Russian famine of 1921 to 1922. The American Relief Administration fed millions after war, and drought pushed whole regions into hunger. An American Relief Administration truck stands in Samara during the Russian famine of the early 1920s. Aid came with food, medicine, and deep suspicion as Americans moved through starving regions of Soviet Russia. A United States soldier studies a knocked-out Sherman near Bastogne on December 30, 1944. The extra side armor became a perfect aiming point, and the added steel did not save the tank. A zoology class at Aligarh Muslim University in 1946 is split by a screen, with women seated apart from the men. One room held the same lesson, but not the same freedom. A camouflaged T-34 hides in a village near Rzhev in January 1942 during some of the war's hardest fighting. A rifle hangs outside the turret, a small detail that shows how cramped and improvised life inside the tank could be. Professional swimmers line up by the pool in England in 1919. Their tight racing suits and serious stare make the early sport look strangely modern. Passengers in life vests crowd the sloping deck of the Vestris on November 12, 1928, as the liner begins to die at sea. The ship sank after a delayed distress call, and 159 people were lost before rescue ships could reach them. The control room of the Hindenburg shows the giant Nazi German airship from the inside in 1936. It was the largest airship on Earth, built to carry passengers across the Atlantic in a machine that looked almost unreal. Ford workers build cars on a moving assembly line in 1913. This system made automobiles faster and cheaper and changed factory work across the world. Tokyo residents bow their heads as they hear Emperor Hirohito announce Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945. For many, it was the first time they had ever heard the emperor's voice. Leonard Whiting was photographed in 1880 as an American man publicly presented as the world's heaviest. Old publicity often turned extreme body size into spectacle, and titles like this were not always carefully proven. Nikolai Kobalkov was born in 1851 without arms and legs, yet learned to write, draw, and work with remarkable skill. His body shocked people, but his discipline and talent made him unforgettable. Arnold Schwarzenegger stands beside Lou Ferrigno in the 1970s, two giants from bodybuilding's golden age. Their rivalry helped turn muscle shows into worldwide spectacle. At a match factory in Cherepovets in 1977, Tomilova packs the plant's millionth box. One worker sealed a number so huge it turned an ordinary shift into a record. Japanese ama divers swim for shellfish and pearls, using only breath, rope, and nerve. This tradition lasted for centuries, with women diving deep and returning again and again through the cold sea. German soldiers stand beside a staff car as a Soviet village burns in June 1941. The smoke turns the whole sky black, capturing how fast entire settlements vanished in the first weeks of the invasion. Bombardier Sergei Dupli sits inside an Il-4 over Sevastopol in May 1944 in a photo by Yevgeny Kalday. The cramped metal cockpit looks like a flying cage, with every wire and lever wrapped around one man on a combat run. A British spotter studies the sky during the Second World War, trying to identify fast incoming aircraft before they arrive. In that war, civilians became part of the warning system because a few seconds could mean everything. Austrian soldiers push a machine gun raft through the Danube in July 1938 during a military display. They used their own legs as paddles, turning a river crossing into a strange live weapon drill. Laundry lines cover the deck of the battleship October Revolution in besieged Leningrad in 1942, hiding it in plain sight. A warship was turned into a fake city rooftop so enemy pilots might miss it. A window cleaner hangs on the vast glass wall of the United Nations Secretariat on April 17, 1953. One man against that endless grid makes the skyscraper look almost inhuman. The Italian liner Principessa Yolanda tipped over just minutes after launch in 1907, even though it was the biggest ship Italy had built. A luxury giant with electric lights, telephones, and Marconi radio died before its first voyage even began. American agents seize bootleg alcohol in the United States in 1930 during Prohibition. The ban on liquor made smuggling so huge that whole boats were loaded with illegal bottles. Street acrobats perform high above a New York crowd in 1931 with no safety net below. One slip would have ended the show in a second, which is exactly why no one could look away. German soldiers pose on a Ju-52 after a forced landing in Norway in 1940. Even half sunk in the water, the transport still looks massive and strangely calm. Women from the Women's Organization Against Outrageous Styles protest padded hips and extra-long skirts in Berkeley on August 23, 1947. Even fashion turned into a street fight after the war, with women publicly battling over how women should look. Jumbo stands over his keeper, Matthew Scott, the man most closely linked to the most famous elephant of the 19th century. Before circus fame in America, Jumbo survived a move that likely saved him from the starving Paris Zoo during the Franco-Prussian War. Protective masks worn during the bubonic plague outbreak in Manila in 1912 made people look almost faceless. Fear of infection changed ordinary clothing into something that looks eerie even now. American soldiers inspect a captured train of German V-2 rockets near Bromskirchen in late March 1945. These were the world's first long-range ballistic missiles, and both sides knew they were staring at the future of war. An Anzac self-firing rifle waits in the Gallipoli trenches in 1915, built to keep shooting after the soldiers were gone. That simple trick helped hide the evacuation of about 80,000 men with shockingly few losses. A carnival float in Cologne in 1938 turns Joseph Stalin into a giant caricature during the Third Reich. Even public festivals became propaganda stages where politics was pushed through masks, jokes, and spectacle. A National Guardsman points his weapon into a car during anti-Vietnam War protests in Chicago in 1968. The image shows how fast a political protest could turn into a street scene that looked like war. A United States B-17 drops food over the Netherlands in the final days of the war in 1945. These mercy flights fed a starving population just before Germany's surrender. Shuttered doors lined Jewish Street in Vilnius during Sabbath in the 1920s. The silence says everything, with an entire street pausing at once for one holy day. Women and children climb from an underground shelter in Smolensk on July 16, 1941, under orders from German soldiers. The photo catches a brutal moment when civilians had nowhere to hide but the earth itself. Residents wade through flooded streets in Niigata after the June 16, 1964 earthquake in Japan. The quake left about 500,000 people without homes, turning whole neighborhoods into waterlogged ruins. A rare 1972 photo shows Viet Cong fighters moving through the Mekong Delta during a direct clash in the Vietnam War. Most war photos caught the aftermath, but this one freezes the battle itself in the water and smoke. Specialists prepare to enter the 3 Mile Island reactor building in July 1980 after the worst commercial nuclear power accident in United States history. One partial core meltdown turned this sealed doorway into one of the most feared places in America. Doroshka was a trench runner in the First World War, carrying cigarettes and small comforts to a sapper regiment. He lifted morale, crossed the lines like a tiny courier, and survived being hit twice. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry stands beside his wrecked Caudron Simoun in the Libyan desert in 1935 after crashing during a record attempt from Paris to Saigon. He and his co-pilot wandered the desert for days and were saved only when death was already close. German prisoners of war stand in punishment cells in a camp in France in 1945. The circular cages look almost unreal, turning discipline after the war into a scene as harsh as the conflict itself. Boston firefighter Bob Mackey moves toward an 88-year-old woman on a window ledge in June 1977. He is trying to stop her from jumping. Russian prisoners of war endure a punishment in Austrian captivity during the First World War. Their bodies were hung against the wall by straps to force pain and humiliation. Joe Louis walks through Harlem with his wife in 1935, one day after beating former champion Max Baer. That win made him a national star before he ever became world heavyweight champion. Adolf Hitler receives a Christmas visit from men dressed as Santa in Germany in 1937. Even holiday celebrations were turned into staged loyalty around the Nazi leader. This Lockheed Constellation slid off the runway in Chicago on December 18, 1949, and stopped right on a city street beside a passing streetcar. After weather diversions and a fast landing in fog, Lomi Puckett sat on her porch with a rifle in July 1958, trying to stop the state from taking her home for the Golden State Freeway. After days of tension, officers tricked their way inside, disarmed her, and the house was later torn down for just $9,000. A tiny assistant sits on the buried head of Rameses II in this 1950 photograph by Maxime Duchamp, making the scale almost unreal. After thousands of years under desert sand, the giant face of the ancient pharaoh looked like it was waking up again. 4 men in Bombay carry a full piano through the street in 1958, turning a huge instrument into a moving load with pure balance and teamwork. This barricade rose on land planned for Tokyo's new airport, where farmers and student activists turned the construction zone into a fortress and fought to keep it standing. The clash delayed the project for years and became one of Japan's most explosive post-war protests. A wedding procession moves through the rocky hills of Amman in 1930, with riders, banners, and a crowd stretching down the road. The photo captures a time when Jordan's capital was still a small desert city. Militia fighters in Than Tri train on a fake low-flying aircraft in 1965, aiming with old rifles that could still damage real warplanes. A Polish student in the 1970s writes tiny study notes on her legs, turning her own skin into a secret memory sheet before an exam. The photo feels almost absurd because it shows how far exam stress could push someone before a single question was even asked. Boats rest in a shallow Abu Dhabi bay in 1975, when much of the coast still looked open, quiet, and untouched. The scene feels almost unreal today because this calm strip of water stood just before the city's giant modern rise. American Rangers scrambled through their base in Sierra Leone in May 1997, caught in a sudden raid before they could even dress properly. German troops ready Goliath tracked charges on Piaskowa Street during the Warsaw Uprising, August 11, 1944. These tiny machines carried explosives through the ruins like remote-controlled weapons from a much later age. Divers in heavy suits descend into the Yenisei during the Krasnoyarsk bridge works between 1896 and 1899. The scene looks almost unreal because bridge builders were already working underwater in armor-like gear before the 20th century began. Victory fireworks burst over Red Square on May 9, 1945, as an enormous crowd filled Moscow to mark the end of the war in Europe. The scene feels overwhelming because one square held both pure relief. North Vietnamese soldiers rush across open ground near Route 9 in southern Laos during Operation Lam Son 719, the failed push to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Arthur Berry, the famous New York jewel thief, walks in custody here after turning high society robbery into a strange kind of legend. He stole gems from the rich with planning so precise that even being robbed by him became a status symbol. 70-year-old Elizabeth Arnold, called the only woman blacksmith in England, shoes a horse beside a 400-year-old forge in Kent in 1938. The striking part is not just her age, but that she was doing one of the hardest village trades in Britain. West Berlin photo reporters wait on Friedrichstrasse in 1961 as American and Soviet tanks face each other in the Berlin crisis. Musicians in plastic rain capes keep playing in Taiwan in 1996, trying to please a saint through the downpour. The image is unforgettable because even the rain could not silence this ritual performance. Boatmen row hard off Accra in 1960, just 3 years after Ghana became independent and declared itself a republic. The fierce surf outside the port made every return feel like a direct fight with the sea. A Moscow Theater Society meeting on August 21, 1968, votes to support the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. The most striking detail is how a room full of raised hands turns a historic crackdown into a public show of approval. The Shah of Iran wipes his eyes during Jimmy Carter's speech in Washington on November 15, 1977. The gas reached the ceremony from a protest broken up outside the White House. Visitors in Beijing study the wreckage of 4 U-2 spy planes brought down by the People's Liberation Army. The strongest detail is that these secret high-altitude aircraft ended up displayed in public like trophies. Boys pack ice cream cones inside an Oklahoma City workshop in 1917. One worker was just 12 and had already left school for the job. Workers packed the Venus de Milo for evacuation from the Louvre in 1940. One of the world's most famous statues was treated like cargo to save it from war. Newsboys hold up fresh papers in the early 20th century, when more than half of United States newspapers were sold by children on the street. Unsold copies meant a loss, because yesterday's news was already worthless. A street performer swallows a sword in China in 1904 as a tight crowd watches from only a few steps away. The strongest detail is how children stand in the front row for a trick that could go wrong in an instant. Japanese oil concessions spread across northern Sakhalin in the 1940s, operating on Soviet land during the war years. These fields stayed in Japanese hands for more than 18 years before Moscow took them over in 1944. Actors stage a puppet show for children in the ruins of Sarakib, surrounded by broken concrete and collapsed homes. The strongest fact is that the audience here is sitting inside the destruction itself. Gustav Whitehead stands beside his ultralight aircraft, which some aviation historians believe flew in Connecticut in 1901 before the Wright brothers. The key fact is that newspapers reported his powered flights, but he never won lasting recognition. The wreckage of the New York mid-air collision lies in Brooklyn on December 7, 1960, after one aircraft crashed into a neighborhood. At that moment, it was the deadliest disaster in civil aviation history. Lieutenant Stephen Owen Musselman's A 7 Corsair lies wrecked near Hanoi after being shot down on September 10, 1972. The key fact is that local people are already pulling through the debris in the flooded field. Students sit in a classroom in Hofuf, Saudi Arabia, in 1949, with a large map of Europe hanging behind them. The map shows how foreign geography was already part of lessons in a traditional local school. A United Nations armored vehicle evacuates Turkish Cypriot women and children from Kokina to Lefka on August 9, 1964. The key fact is that civilians were being moved out under armed protection during heavy fighting. A Warsaw insurgent emerges from a sewer after the uprising was crushed in 1944. The key fact is that the sewers became one of the last hiding places before surrender. Germans laugh at Charlie Chaplin as Hitler in The Great Dictator in 1946. A film banned by the Nazis was now being watched in defeated Germany. A group of Germans plays bowling on an outdoor lane on the Isle of Man in 1914. Soon, many Germans on the island were interned after the war began. Japanese-American families wait beside a train under military guard during the forced relocation of 1942. Most of them had committed no crime, and many were already United States citizens. Political prisoners study geography in Akatui Prison in 1908, chained to the benches during class. After the 1905 revolution, thousands like them were sent deep into Siberia. Floodwater swallows Neglinaya Street in Moscow in June 1965, leaving a trolleybus and cars half underwater. In this one frame, a city street turns into a rescue route for boats. Khanty people stand after trading fur for vodka with a local merchant in 1909. Fur was being exchanged for alcohol instead of money. Rear Admiral Foti Krylov awards a Soviet Navy diver after mine-clearing work in the River Spree in Berlin, May 1945. Even after the city fell, divers still had to clear hidden explosives from the water. North Korean women captured near Taegu on October 8, 1950, are led toward a train for transfer to a prisoner camp in Busan. The Korean War sent not only soldiers, but also female personnel into captivity. Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip greet Akinzua II of Benin in 1956. The meeting joined the British royal couple with the ruler of one of West Africa's oldest kingdoms. Rag pickers rest beside carts loaded with scraps on New York's Lower East Side in 1886. They sold glass and torn cloth by weight for recycling, and the job was seen as one step above begging. Nina Sokolova, a Soviet diver and engineer officer, helped build the fuel pipeline laid across the bottom of Lake Ladoga in 1943. That underwater line became one of besieged Leningrad's lifelines. A Grumman panther floats off Korea on August 7, 1950, after falling into the sea during a landing on USS Philippine Sea. Squadron Commander R. Weymouth is standing on the nose, waiting to be picked up. Peasant families take in a homeless boy in this Arkady Shykit photo from 1927. After the Civil War, the Soviet Union was dealing with millions of abandoned children. Workers sort through piles of Pripyat residents' belongings after the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. Everyday objects were treated as contaminated waste and buried instead of returned. American soldiers in Vietnam use a shotgun like a pipe to smoke cannabis in 1970. The photo shows how low morale and easy access to drugs had already reached the front lines. A Polish family searches through the remains of their bombed home in Warsaw in 1939. After the invasion began, civilians were digging their lives out of the ruins almost immediately. Passengers crowd the entrance of Orsay Station in Paris in 1940, trying to leave the city before the fighting reaches them. In those days, train stations turned into escape points for entire families carrying everything they could take. Imelda Marcos's shoe collection is shown in Manila in 1988 after the fall of the Marcos regime. The collection contained about 2,500 pairs. Soldiers crossed the Dnieper on makeshift rafts in September 1943 under direct fire. The river assault became one of the largest and bloodiest crossings of the war. A sailor climbs the side of HMS Cressy as the sinking cruiser's stern lifts from the sea on September 22, 1914. U-9 sank 3 British cruisers in less than 90 minutes that morning. Women prisoners sit packed into a barrack in Auschwitz in January 1945. The camp held women from many countries in conditions of extreme overcrowding and starvation. A Dutch-Jewish couple hides in a tiny basement in Amsterdam in 1945, in a space so low they could not stand upright. Only the building porter knew they were there. 13-year-old Princess Elizabeth stands with her school swim team after winning a sports award in 1939. The future queen had already earned a badge in the pool years before she took the throne. American agents dismantled the German B-8 reactor in Haigerloch in April 1945 after finding it hidden near the end of the war. Inside it hung chains of uranium cubes, part of one of Nazi Germany's last secret nuclear experiments. Women from Lefkada dance with barrels balanced on their heads during the International Folklore Festival in 1963. The island was famous for wine, and this dance turned working loads into a public performance. Police pose with a young black man they had just pulled out alive from a lynch mob in 1934. In the United States, thousands of black people were lynched, and many local authorities either did nothing or joined in. A Soviet R-5 aircraft carries paratroopers in external side cabins in 1936, using one of Pavel Grokovsky's most unusual transport designs. Instead of seats inside the fuselage, the troops rode outside the plane in attached compartments. Berlin lawyer Elizabeth Gloden stands before Nazi judges in 1944, accused after helping hide people hunted by the regime. She and her family were later executed by guillotine on November 30, 1944. A medical worker examines immigrant children at Ellis Island during the typhus outbreak in 1911. New arrivals could be held back, isolated, or refused entry if inspectors suspected disease. While we're looking at these photos, don't forget to write in the comments. Which historical shot did you like the most, and for what reason? Racing driver Duncan Hamilton sits on the grid before Le Mans in 1953, where he and Tony Rolt went on to win for Jaguar. He had spent the night drinking after a mistaken disqualification and still started the race when the team was put back in. German sailors shot from Chinese traders on the deck of a warship in China in 1900. Foreign troops were in China that year during the Boxer Uprising. Japanese officers Tsuyoshi Noda and Toshiaki Mukai pose in Nanjing in December 1937. Japanese newspapers openly reported their contest to reach 100 killings first, and both men were executed in 1948. A German Shepherd rests after a long search at the World Trade Center site after September 11, 2001. Some rescue dogs became distressed by finding so few survivors, so volunteers hid in the debris to give them live rescues. Alice Hoyler Ramsey became the first woman to drive across the United States from ocean to ocean on August 7, 1909. She made the trip when most roads were still rough, unpaved, and barely marked. Vancouver firefighters show off their towering ladder in 1910, with men climbing nearly the full height above the street. At the time, these giant rolling ladders were one of the few ways to reach upper floors before modern aerial trucks. Captured German soldiers clear the field during halftime of a match between Dynamo Moscow and Dynamo Tbilisi in Moscow in 1945. Football returned to Soviet stadiums just weeks after the war in Europe ended. Sophie Scholl was a Munich student who helped lead the White Rose, a small group that spread anti-Nazi leaflets in Germany during the Second World War. She was only 21 when she was killed in 1943. Women in London test radio handbags in 1936, with each bag hiding a real portable receiver inside. These sets could pick up broadcasts from stations as far as 80 kilometers away, years before pocket radios became common. Salem, Massachusetts lit a giant Independence Day bonfire in 1930, built from a 40-tier pyramid of barrels. The structure was recorded at 145 feet, more than 41 meters, and became one of the most famous holiday displays of its era. Думал на протяжении секунды, grenadiers of the Italian Littorio Division rushed through the snow at Fort Saint-Ours-Haut on the Italian-French border in the winter of 1944 to 1945. This alpine line was part of the old frontier fort system. Don Gentile, a United States Army Air Forces pilot, poses beside his aircraft with the name and artwork that made him one of the most recognized American flyers of the Second World War. Robert Wadlow walks to school with his younger siblings, already towering over them while still in his teens. He reached 8 feet 11 inches because of an overactive pituitary gland and remains the tallest person ever reliably recorded. The wreck of a German Bf-109 is hauled through London in 1940 after crashing during the Battle of Britain. That fighter became one of the clearest symbols of a failed air campaign that was meant to break Britain from the sky. Young people walk across Red Square in Moscow in 1991, wearing casual clothes with Soviet symbols against the backdrop of St. Basil's Cathedral. The photo was taken in the final year of the Soviet Union, just months before the state itself disappeared. Alessandro Moreschi, photographed around 1900, was the only castrato singer ever captured in solo sound recordings. His voice survives from the very end of a tradition that had lasted for centuries and then vanished. Soldiers of the United States. 147th Infantry Regiment share cigarettes with Japanese prisoners on Iwo Jima in 1945. The regiment was later nicknamed the Cavemen because it was sent to clear the island's last hidden underground holdouts. A bomb damaged a train at West Ham Station in East London on March 15, 1976, leaving the carriage ripped open. The attack killed 1 person and injured 9, bringing violence from the Northern Ireland conflict onto the London Underground. German troops charged toward Le Mort-Homme at Verdun in March 1916, one of the most contested hills on the Western Front. Verdun lasted about 10 months and became one of the longest and costliest battles of the First World War. Japanese soldiers posed beside a statue of Sun Yat-sen, the Chinese revolutionary leader who helped end the Qing dynasty in 1911. Christine and Léa Papin, later known as the Papin sisters, were French maids whose case became one of the most famous crime stories in France in 1933. The shock around them was so great that the case later inspired books, plays. Jody Roberts disappeared in 1985 and was found 12 years later in Alaska, living under a different name with a new family. Her case became one of the rare, widely verified examples of dissociative fugue. A chief from Mancon in Cameroon wears a ceremonial uniform modeled on the Imperial German Guard, showing how colonial power was turned into public display. German rule often gave such uniforms and honorary ranks to local chiefs. A field grave marks 24 men of the 2nd East Lancashire Regiment who died together on March 14, 1915, near Rouge Croix on the La Bassée Road. One artillery shell struck during a rifle inspection and wiped out the group in a single moment. The Japanese cruiser Aoba lies in Kure Harbor in 1946 to 1947, being broken up after air attacks left it wrecked in the final months of the war. Aoba had served from the 1920s through many major Pacific battles. Grenadiers of the 3rd Battalion of the Littorio Division marched through the snow in the Stura Valley toward their field kitchen on the Italian-French border in the winter of 1944 to 1945. By that stage of the war, British soldiers of the 95th Regiment pose with the heavy mustaches that Army rules demanded from 1860 to 1916. A soldier could be punished for shaving his upper lip, making facial hair part of military discipline for more than half a century. Salvador Dali stands beside Francisco Franco, the Spanish ruler whose regime lasted from the end of the Civil War until 1975. Dali's open praise for Franco shocked many artists and helped turn him into one of the most divisive cultural figures of 20th century Spain. Military police clash with Vietnam War protesters outside the Pentagon on October 21, 1967, during one of the largest anti-war demonstrations in the United States. More than 100,000 people came to Washington that weekend. Mussolini rides through Piazza Castello in Turin on May 14, 1939, with troops lined in formation along the street. The visit came at the peak of fascist pageantry in Italy, just months before the Second World War began. Men stand at the field where Ohio State student Theora Hicks was found in Columbus in 1929 after a discovery that stunned the city. The case became even more shocking when the killer was identified as Dr. James Snook. Black Hundred supporters marched with portraits of Tsar Nicholas II in Odessa in 1905, just after the October Manifesto shook the Russian Empire. The Black Hundreds backed the throne with fierce street politics. People in Yukon crowd Pioneer Hall for a masquerade ball on December 31, 1899, celebrating the last night of the 19th century. The Klondike Gold Rush had turned the far north into one of the busiest places in North America. This is the military identity card of Colonel Ernst Frey, an Austrian Jew who served in the Vietnamese People's Army in 1949. His path from Central Europe to Vietnam made him one of the most unusual foreign officers in the early First Indochina War. Saddam Hussein sits with friends at his wedding to Sajida Talfa on April 28, 1963, years before he became Iraq's ruler. The photo shows a young party activist before his rise to power turned him into one of the most feared leaders in the Middle East. Marines unload supplies onto Iwo Jima in 1945 as landing ships crowd the shoreline under a dark sky. This black volcanic beach turned logistics into a brutal struggle because men had to move fuel, ammunition. At Yokosuka Naval Air Depot in late 1945, a S. Gecko stands beside a Betty, a Seiun, and a Suisei after Japan's defeat. The lineup captures several of Japan's best-known wartime aircraft gathered in one silent post-war graveyard. Miners at the Tamarack Shaft in Michigan pose with their lunch pails on a pile of waste rock in 1905, ready for another day underground. Copper country mines like Tamarack went thousands of feet deep. Thousands lined the streets of Pyongyang as Kim Il-sung's funeral motorcade passes through the North Korean capital in 1994. His funeral became one of the largest ever staged, turning public mourning into a vast display of state power. Foreign volunteers of the Vietnamese People's Army posed during their journey to North Vietnam in 1954. The photo shows how the war drew in committed supporters from far outside Vietnam just as French colonial rule was collapsing. A Royal Saudi Air Force T-28 Trojan stands abandoned at Tabuk Air Base in February 1998, with other worn aircraft scattered behind it. Built as a trainer in the early Cold War, the T-28 later served in combat in several countries before scenes like this marked its quiet end. Chief John Smith of the Ojibwe in Minnesota was photographed in ceremonial dress and became famous for his extraordinary claimed age. When he died in 1922, some said he was 137. Japanese-American families stand behind barbed wire at an internment camp in the Pacific Northwest in the early 1940s, caught in one of the most sweeping wartime removals in United States history. More than 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry were forced into camps. The African National Congress office in London stands torn open after an explosion on March 14, 1982. The blast hit one of the best-known anti-apartheid movement sites outside South Africa and showed how far that conflict could reach. A woman works as a train conductor in London in 1916, one of many jobs women took over while men were away at war. When the war ended, many of these roles were handed back to men, despite women already proving they could do them. Malcolm McLean stands above stacked containers in 1956 as he prepares to prove that truck trailers could be moved by sea far faster than loose cargo. That idea launched container shipping and transformed global trade. Stumphorn of the Cheyenne was photographed in Montana in 1920, holding a carbine said to have been taken at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The weapon linked him directly to one of the most famous native victories against the United States Army in 1876. John McCain walks at Gia Lam Airport in Hanoi in 1973 after more than 5 years as a prisoner of war in Vietnam. He later became one of the most famous former prisoners of the war in American politics. Police pull 13-year-old Milton Kerr back to safety after he got trapped on the side of a 75-foot cliff at Lover's Leap in August 1953. He had climbed down with a friend to recover a lost baseball cap when falling rocks blocked his way back up. Vienna opened the world's first indoor ski hall in 1927 inside the former Nordwestbahnhof station, called Schneepalast. It had a 70-meter wooden slope, a jump hill, and an electric conveyor, but closed within months under heavy debt. German soldiers stand near a burning house in a Polish village in 1939 during the invasion of Poland. The campaign opened the Second World War in Europe and quickly turned many towns and villages into ruins. Olga Chekova, a Russian-born actress who built a major film career in Germany, is seen here during a meeting with Adolf Hitler in 1939. Her closeness to the top of the Third Reich later fueled years of rumors. A young woman of the French resistance stands armed during the Paris Uprising in 1944 as the city moved toward liberation. Women served as couriers, medics, scouts, and fighters, yet many of their names were never recorded. A huge fire fills a Moscow street with smoke in 1960 as crowds pack the scene below. The photo shows how quickly one city blaze could turn into a mass spectacle in the center of the Soviet capital. The Great Bridge being built over the Volga near Simbirsk caught fire on July 7, 1914, and this photo shows the 8th span collapsing with a tower crane. The blaze started from hot riveting work and destroyed one of Europe's most ambitious bridge projects before it was finished. Mounted police break up a Communist Party protest in London on March 23, 1930, with one officer carrying a sword. The image shows how British police still used cavalry and edged weapons for crowd control well into the 20th century. A captured Soviet female medic carries a wounded Soviet soldier on a stretcher in the summer of 1941 while German troops watch nearby. Soviet women served in huge numbers at the front, and medics often had to pull the wounded out under direct fire. The first escalator in Britain opened at Harrods in London on November 16, 1898, and many shoppers were too nervous to step onto it. Staff at the top offered frightened riders brandy or smelling salts after the trip because the moving stairs felt almost unreal at the time. Students march in West Germany after the death of Benno Ohnesorg, carrying a banner that reads, "Political Murder." His death in 1967 became a turning point that helped ignite the West German student movement. Members of the Bulu people in Cameroon pose in 1931 after collecting money for hungry families in the United States during the Great Depression. They sent just $3.77. Miss America contestants from several United States posed together in 1935 during the pageant lineup. The contest had already become a major national spectacle by then, turning local winners into faces of their states. Polish envoys surrendered the Modlin Fortress to German officers on September 29, 1939, after 2 weeks of defense on the road to Warsaw. The fortress was commanded by General Victor Tom, a former officer of the Imperial Russian Army. White parents protest school integration in New Orleans in 1960 as Ruby Bridges entered an all-white school under federal protection. She was only 6 years old, and her walk into that building became one of the clearest images of the civil rights era. Chained women stand on Zanzibar in the 1860s or 1870s, when the island was a major hub in the East African slave trade under Omani rule. Slavery there was officially abolished on March 5, 1873. A Red Army medic helps a wounded soldier through the ruins of Stalingrad in 1942. Frontline nurses often carried the wounded out themselves, making rescue as dangerous as combat. Pope Pius XII visits Romans after the bombing of the city in 1943 as a dense crowd gathers around him. His public appearance in the ruins became one of the most recognized Vatican images of the Second World War. Stores stand damaged after the Watts unrest in Los Angeles in 1965, which began after the arrest of Marquette Frye during a traffic stop. 6 days of disorder left 34 people dead and caused damage across a wide area of the city. A Boer woman in a British camp holds her dead child during the Second Boer War in 1901. Tens of thousands of Boer civilians, many of them children, died in these camps from hunger and disease. Captured Yi Hequan fighters from the Boxer Uprising sit under guard in Tianjin in 1901 after the foreign intervention in China. The uprising drew in 8 foreign powers and ended with a crushing defeat that reshaped Qing China. Private First Class Ferris M. Tuohy drinks coffee aboard ship off Eniwetok in February 1944 after 2 days of fighting in the Marshall Islands. The photo captures the raw exhaustion of Pacific combat, with men battered. A Chinese woman volunteer is fitted with bundled grenades during the Battle of Taiyuan in April 1938, when China was desperately short of anti-tank weapons. The image captures how far the war pushed civilians and volunteers. A Russian family marked their gate in Baku in 1990 to show they were not Armenian during the anti-Armenian pogroms. The single word on the metal door became a desperate shield in a city where identity could decide survival. Sergei Kovalev sits inside a bus with Basayev's gunmen during the Budyonovsk hostage crisis on June 19, 1995. He voluntarily stayed with the hostages, making this one of the most striking images from one of Russia's most shocking terror attacks. Residents walk through the ruins of Leningrad after bombing on September 8, 1941, the day the blockade began. The siege lasted about 872 days and became one of the deadliest city blockades in history. Belarusian partisan women pose with their personal weapons in 1944 deep in the forest war behind German lines. Women served as scouts, medics, saboteurs, and fighters in Soviet partisan units, and many operated in the deadliest occupied zones of Belarus. People on a Budapest rooftop tear down a red star during the Hungarian uprising in 1956. The revolt became one of the boldest anti-Soviet moments of the Cold War before Soviet forces crushed it. A South Vietnamese ranger refuses a handshake from a North Vietnamese delegate during ceasefire talks in Saigon in 1973. Even after the peace agreement, the bitterness between the two sides was still visible face to face. Children of the working class sit and play among rubble in northern England in the 1970s or 1980s in a photograph by Tish Murtha. Her camera turned neglected streets into evidence. A black man is surrounded by an angry crowd in a 1959 photograph by Ken Heyman after a moment involving a child sparked sudden outrage. The image freezes the raw tension of segregation-era America, where even a split second could turn into a public mob scene. Wrecked Soviet aircraft lie across the Minsk airfield in early July 1941 after the rapid German advance. The scene shows how the opening weeks of the invasion destroyed huge numbers of Soviet planes before many could even leave the ground. I will be very grateful for your subscription to the channel. Every day I try to tell you about such interesting historical photos.